So that was an Allegro, number 26 from Giuliani's Op.50. Follow the lesson for free. We're going to be talking about a few concepts and doing a walkthrough of the piece. But if you're interested, I do have an edition of all 32 works in Giuliani's Op.50, and there's a link for that in the description. This is a very popular work. It's in lots of books, sometimes as a performance piece, sometimes as an etude. But nevertheless, it's pretty clear in terms of the voicing. There's a really clear two voices the entire time, so a bass voice and an upper voice. And there's some mixing of arpeggios in with the melodic material. So lots of things to work on in the piece, of course. There's nothing particularly awkward about the piece. Nevertheless, due to the length of the piece and how much of the guitar it explores and just a couple of tiny sections, it does make the piece a little bit more on the firmly intermediate or later intermediate. But like I said, nothing too crazy in terms of like stretches. There's no bar chords or anything like that really, except at the very end. So just things to work on, plenty to work on. So whenever you have two voices, of course you can practice the voices separately just to kind of get used to them, especially the upper voice in this particular case, even though the first measure is articulated in a very specific way. So let's just talk about that. Let's first just talk about the articulation of the first measure, and then how it contrasts with the articulation of the second measure and other measures in the piece. So I would observe the bass note rests in this particular piece very, very specifically. So the note values of pieces, I think, are the note values of the rhythmic values of the notes. I would observe those very specifically, and also taking a look at the bass note rests and making sure you're muting the basses at those places. So when we look at the first measure, we have some articulation, and it's kind of broken into this voice exchange. So you want to sync up the muting of the bass with the playing of the upper note. So you can just practice up to the first bass note rest in that way. So when you put your thumb back on the string to mute it, it's synchronized with the playing of the upper note. Let's practice to the next rest. So the playing and the muting are on the same beat, and so should be synced up. So that articulation contrasts with the legato second measure. So there we have a quarter note bass that you won't mute until you get to that next quarter note beat. So it really changes the articulation. You have this kind of sharp angular articulation followed by a much more legato one, but also some rests to clean up the texture in this piece. So just a close observation of those, I think, is the important thing. And then through the rest of the piece, you're really, you're trying to be legato in the upper line, and just to get your phrasing all together. And every once in a while, he'll interject that articulated figure that you want to look for, but otherwise you're playing a legato game. So let's just do a walkthrough of the piece, and we'll talk about it as we go. I'll go quite a bit slower. So you want to observe that rest in the quarter note rest in the bass there. Measure 3. Now, in this particular part, in measure 5, the open A from the previous measure might be ringing out, and so what I do to stop that, because that angular texture really wants to be heard, when I mute the D from measure 5, I try to put my thumb in a little bit deeper so it hits the 5th string with the side of my thumb. You can see I kind of really get my thumb in there so that the 5th string actually gets stopped by the side of my thumb while I'm muting the D string. So just to repeat that. Mute, and you're going to try to mute the D and the A, muting the A with the side of your thumb. That is one aspect of measure 5 that, you know, an early intermediate player might not do. And that's okay if they don't do it. That's just fine. But a more advanced intermediate player or later intermediate player can actually work on that technique to actually really clean up the texture and keep that measure 5 clean. If you don't do it, it sounds fine. You can hear that there's lots of resonance happening. It doesn't create that angular texture that we would like from measure 5. So when we actually mute it, we get a much cleaner and defined texture. So that's something that the firmly intermediate players can work on. Let's continue for measure 6. A little bit of a change here. It's like more melodic and more cheerful. Just a nice clear phrasing and legato. Now, from measure 16 to 19, the original publication does not have any slurs in it, so hammer-ons and pull-offs. But I have added it in this section just because there's so many notes on a single string that I feel it ends up sounding quite choppy. I'll leave it up to you whether you want to include the slurs there or not. I've added them like many editors do, just because it smooths out the section and gets rid of like the... Instead you get... It changes it up a little bit. So I'll leave that up to you whether you want to observe it, but it's not in the original. Cadenza-like thing here. I try to add a little bit of a red at the very top note there, just to break up the metronomic feel of the piece, and that way you can get back into it. Repeat. When you're playing the bar chord here, use your 3rd finger here, that way it's 2nd finger. You don't technically need a bar chord at the very last chord, so I didn't write it in. So you can play without. If it makes you feel more comfortable to lay your 1st finger down into a bar chord there, that's just fine. Whatever allows you to be secure in your playing there. So really great little piece. It's just, it's exciting and it has that texture change, which is really fun, that angular texture versus the very legato texture, and a little bit of exploration of the guitar and some upper register. So making it a very welcome piece in the collection. And I think with careful practice and just very slow practice at first, you can just get those skills under your belt and then just slowly ease up the metronome or the tempo until you feel comfortable with the piece, since there's nothing particularly awkward about it, but some careful practice will be needed.